we're looking at the archaeology of comparison again. And I think it would be best that I organised looking at comparisons with woodlands and forests between Orkney, Cumbria, and Cymru and Cornwall next week. Because there's something I needed to do in the middle. There's an area of comparison that at this stage I thought would be very, very appropriate. We've looked at comparing Iron Age settlements, walled Iron Age settlements. And I laboured over, do I look at comparing Neolithic settlements, which would probably be very similar to what I'd done with the Iron Age settlements? Or do I look at something a little bit more askew with looking at why perfectly fine villages seem to become abandoned throughout history? And throughout the years, I've had my fair share of wandering through streets of abandoned buildings, be they Iron Age, which we've already done, Neolithic, which I'm still thinking about, or we've looked at villages from the medieval period. Bill was with me and we looked at the wonderful medieval village at Hound Tor, which actually, as one big area of this seminar tonight, we are going to be looking at that with a nice little bit of information. And we're going to be looking in a little bit more detail as well at a village stroke town that was completely forgotten about up until the last decade and a half. It's a wonderful site just outside Abergavenny on the road to KARL, and it's one of those fantasy little sets of remains that you wish you'd known about all your life. That's a stone in front of us. You can't get that wrong, can you? RE 1746. Now, that's an appropriate date, isn't it? 1746. This is in Cymru. 1746, if that was in Scotland, that would be synonymous with the Battle of Culloden, 16th of April, and the Scots will always remember that date. But 1746 might also be a time that there are great changes going on across our own landscape here at home. And this village first came to my notice because an old friend of mine, Keith Stockdale, who was working for one of those conservation charities, he was clearing this area, and they were finding buildings of a village that has its own story associated with it. One of those villages that was abandoned for reasons that will come very clear. So where is this village? Well, all these little images as you head out towards Brecon. You've got Abergavenny, just amongst these green trees. You've got this Igraig, this village. So we go back at these images, which I didn't want to show you initially, going back to this stone. So it would be good to look at an article of the week, just as I would do on a Thursday or a Tuesday evening. And this article of the week defines the discovery of this wonderful village. So we'll share this now. So let's do a new share. Let's get to the article. It's very rare that we actually get an article like this. This was published on the 12th of August 2006. Abandoned mountain village. It's a bit like a little bit of a town, actually. It's called a village, but there's shops and there's the remains of a little hall and a church. So this little article says the ruins of an extensive mountain village have been found on the slopes of Sugarloaf near Abergavenny. Scouts working with the British Trust for Conservation Volunteers have spent a week hacking back brambles to reveal 25 houses. So it's not a small number of houses. The site's known as Igraig. It was on the slopes of Sugarloaf. And my son and I said, look, Owen, we're going to go and find this village. So we had an Ordnance Survey map, and you could see the little outlines of something on the Ordnance Survey map on the slopes of Sugarloaf. It's a nice little bit of a stile. And the stile then leads more or less off a road that goes to a couple of houses, off the main road to Crickhowell. And there's a stile, and the routeway actually goes directly through the village, this abandoned village, which was abandoned in the 1800s after its landlord increased villagers' rents. And I looked into this. It's a bit of a strange story, really, because this site could have actually been, this could have developed into a little town, not unlike Crickhowell, actually. It had all the advantages that it could have been. So conservationists believe there may be more buildings to be uncovered, and it's probably very, very true. So this chap by the name of Keith Stockdale, a complete village with several hundred people with orchards and hundreds of animals like pigs and goats and donkeys would have lived there. Well, I wouldn't say it was several hundreds of people. I'd say more like about 150 odd people, but a sizable village by any standards. And it hasn't been touched since it was abandoned about 150 years ago. Now, one thing, unfortunately, I haven't got images of, but I like to dabble with YouTube now and again. And I like to visit abandoned places. And you get these weird little abandoned villages on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, and little houses, and the kettle is still on the stove, and the table is still laid, and the house has just been left. It's really, really eerie. And every time I think about images like that and I see them, I think about this village. And these villages, we don't look at many tonight, but these villages that we are looking at, like this one, they weren't really abandoned for the usual reasons, or some of them were abandoned for the usual reasons. And they are tragic stories. And like the abandoned villages that we've already seen a few weeks back in connection with our landscape villages that have actually been flooded, well, this village, people were just told to leave. And the date 1746 behind me is a very interesting date, because it was in 1746 we find a lot of evidence in Scotland of villages being abandoned. We're now archaeologically excavating them, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Let's just finish this article. The village probably fell into private hands, and the landlord decided to put up the rent. The villagers didn't have the money, so he came and took all their animals to Abergavenny market to pay for it. The villagers all left because their livelihood had gone, and the landlord probably came and smashed the doors and roofs so no one would come back. So this is not like the clearances of Scotland, and it's not like the clearances that we had in our own land and the clearances of Ireland. It's just somebody decided that I'm going to put up rents. People weren't prepared to pay for it, and the whole village was emptied. Everyone left. And we hear about the tragedy of the Scottish clearances, but in many ways, this village is very much left to its own devices in history. And it remained untouched. It remained hidden. And I don't think they really they really started looking into this until about this point. Archaeologists were aware of this, and a report was made about a decade before, but it hadn't been made public. So when Keith was working there, because it hadn't been made public, this was the great discovery. This was, look at what we've got. As the undergrowth, which had hidden the village for so long, was cleared away, the size of the village became clear. And when me and my son Owen, we went up there, we looked in all the bushes, and we had a little bit of an exploration. There is more up there, but the areas that they didn't clear the heavy undergrowth, we couldn't exactly get to them. So the Drovers Road, that's the little footpath I've just described, and a Drovers Road going through the village, cottages, a bakery, toilets, interesting toilets around this time. Now that's rather interesting, toilets, because public toilets weren't really accessible in Britain. Nobody really had public toilets until about the 1850s. So this village had these toilets, and you've got two-story building further up the mountainside. So this was a place wanting to go somewhere. And the discovery of a rare beehive pigsty, which we'll see two images of, which are almost identical to one that you actually find at St. Fagans. And there's the inscription behind me. An inscription above a doorway has been uncovered, which dates to 1746. So the village is thought to have been lived in from beginning of the 1700s to around 1840, 1850 odd. And Mr. Stockdale said the existence of the village was brought to his attention by Cadw, the Welsh Historic Monuments Agency, who had been contacted by someone living locally. Now that's an awkward thing, that the archaeologists knew of the village and didn't tell anyone. So it's a fine for Joe Public. So someone came up and realized that there was an awful lot of history here. During the clear up, which was done by scouts from Gloucestershire area, a walkway has been put in place, complete with steps to allow people to wander through the whole village. The walkway isn't actually there now. They put the walkway there in 2006. I visited there about 2005, and it sort of decayed. Like many of these projects, they put the infrastructure and then they don't maintain them. So Stockdale's saying, I think there is a lot more to be found here. It goes right up the mountainside, and it certainly does. Cadw is supporting their reclamation of the village, and a spokesman from Cadw said, this is a complete post-medieval village of great historical and archaeological importance. I could probably ask the question of all of you now, did you know this existed? And the answer is probably no. Got a little bit more information, actually. And it's always been the idea of mine to actually go towards Brecon Way and to look at Abergavenny and to look at this village. But we never ever got around to doing it, which is a big shame, really. And here's a little bit more information. It describes the abandoned communities of Igreg. Is a steep hill about 3 miles west of Abergavenny. A settlement existed here in the 1800s, stretched out along the side of the hill for about a mile. And that's what it is. It's a row of houses. It's almost as if they flattened, or they worked into the contour of the side of the mountain, and you've got a row of houses on the hillward side, buildings along for around a mile, yes, actually a bit less than that. And then you have buildings on the slope. It was actually declared as a protected site in 1998. And it wasn't until later on that they actually start to clear it. And it's saying that it was lost and people forgot about it, but it's mentioned on the tide maps of 1842. And they worked into doing all this field work. Confirming known features and discovering new ones was often difficult. The hillside is now owned and managed by Forestry Commission Wales. It is covered by broadleaf woodland and areas of planted conifers. Much of it is very steep. At least one structure was spotted on one visit and then never found again. I think that's great. It is likely that unknown features still remain to be discovered. So I think the point with all this, before I do the last little bit there and we look at the images, I've got them much larger actually, is that in living memory, in a way, in living memory, you can have villages and they can completely be lost. Even though they're on maps, they're still forgotten about. And the reason why it was scheduled was because archaeologists realized in 1998 it was there, and the public then realized it was there in 2006. So it's a discovery that we already knew. And lots of things in archaeology, we're rediscovering them. You can't completely discover something new if humans have been there at one time. So the houses at Igraig fall into three groups, with a few scattered houses at the western end. So that's going towards Krakow. Several in the central area and others, including the most well-preserved at the eastern end. One of the houses at the eastern end contained a bakery and possibly a dairy. And you're thinking, this almost sounds like a little miniature town. And we got that date 1746 inscribed on a large stone at the northwest corner of the building, presumably an indication of the date of construction. So when you get press reports, it said it was above the doorway. It's not. It's on the side of the building. And I wanted to really have an opportunity to bring this to you. So let's have a little finger through some of those nice little images. So I think I think you can get sunk into that date. And it's almost as if, well, it's not as if there's another date there as well. And that looks like 18, and there's some other initials, or maybe what that is, that could be basically the 18th of the 8th, 1746, maybe. Yeah, that's what that could refer to, rather than another carving on there. And we see a direct link, and it's almost that tragedy of society. When we think about abandoned landscapes, we're almost very wary about looking about modern abandoned landscapes. I live in the valleys, and you get whole rows of houses just abandoned, and it's going on today. And this has always happened. And what you're doing, you're rediscovering a true gem. Buildings that echoed to children playing and voices only 150 years ago. But one thing I did miss out, very important point, is about the clearances. We're actually inside the pigsty now. Look how well preserved this is. And you get this nice little corbelled roof. So whoever's got their phone on, naughty. I was gonna mention about this clearance thing actually. What we do find, if you want to compare the sense of clearances and the experience of clearances, for example, in Scotland overall, Orkney, Shetland, Scotland, Cumbria, Cymru and Cornwall, it's almost as if the clearances have always gone on. And in the 1700s, people in remote isolated cottages or farms from the 1700s all the way into the 1800s were cleared off the land by clearances. The great landowner wished to clear the land for forestations, for those great forestries that we see all across the land, or the old thing to have sheep grazing. There's more money in having sheep grazing across landscapes than collecting a pittance. However, that in some ways is not accurate, because it's been proven in archaeology by excavating sites such as this one, if we don't have any historical reference, that you get people who are very well off who are also cleared off the land. There's a village that they've excavated in the lowlands of Scotland, and they were finding clay pipes and china and wonderful goods. And you're thinking, these are not poor people, but we're told that they're poor people, and we're told that they're cleared off the landscape. We're told they're not really paying their taxes. So history as it's written is doing us a little bit of a disservice, because it's not giving us the full picture. So looking into this pig coat, pig sty, and I like the way that they're using the word coat as in dove coat, and very similar to an example at St. Fagans. And I didn't actually crawl in there, but this is really obvious. And one of the things that you can actually see is that this whole village is backed into a quarried part of the mountainside. So they've gone out of their way to put this village there. And it's quite possible, if this village has disappeared in history, and we've got it in written history and we've got it on maps, but people have forgotten these places. And it might be that there are other villages like this out there waiting to be found. I can't say they're going to be in a Vale of Glamorgan or anywhere like that. But if this has been rediscovered in the past decade and a bit, decade and a bit, and then officially recorded and scheduled in 1998, with all the aerial photography and LiDAR, there's likelihood that many more of these sites are actually out there. And Bill's been with me when we've been to the likes of Orkney, and you do get lots of areas where you get abandoned villages, and they're, as I've mentioned, they're abandoned for different things. It's not just to do with clearances, and it's not just to do, as I've demonstrated, it's not just to do with the flooding of valleys. It's to do with lots of reasons why people just up and leave. And there doesn't always need to be reasons why people leave. They just think, well, it's like the tragedy of lots of Scottish islands, where people have just thought, well, we're just going. There's just elderly people here, and the youngsters are going to the lowlands, and they're going to universities and shops, and they're not coming back. So it's not because people are forced to move, it's because there are conditions associated with their family. If you want to compare the abandonment of villages across the 4 areas that we look at on a Wednesday, if you compare this with China, Japan, in the southern tip of Japan, there's lots of villages, and the population is getting older and older, and the young boys and girls are moving to Tokyo, Yokohama, and all those wonderful cities of Japan, and they're not going back to the villages. It's not because they don't have electricity and water, because they do. It's just because the young people are going away. So other reasons to abandon settlements. And this is really helpful when we think of that, because when me and Bill are gesticulating and chewing the cud over villages that we had the experience to see when we went on our Cornwall and Devon trip. We went to a village called Houndtor. We were chewing over the cud, and we thought, why was this village abandoned? And the reasons are not actually quite clear. And it's like many of these comparisons of sites the reasons are not clear either. So look at that really chunky building. I remember looking at this, and I went there, and there's actually a tree growing out of the side of the building, and you just thought, well, these buildings are quite substantial, and you just think maybe what would have happened if, and we don't really know. We actually don't know the real true reason why people moved. It's a lot of hearsay, actually. I've seen a document saying something along the lines that there was a school in this village as well. 160 odd years ago, there was a school in the village, and they had everything. There was a description of a shop here as well, and you got the bakery, and you got the farms, and you got like a little village town hall type building and so on. And there's so much more going for this, and you're thinking, well, is the history exactly the way that we're told, that these people were almost forcibly removed? But the buildings do show a high level of wealth as well, as I've described in regards to some of these buildings that have been cleared in Scotland. And again, look how really well preserved that building is. Little doorway on the side, rest of the building's collapsed. This is not a vulgaris common building. Some of these 25 buildings in the village are a really nice high status in mind, thought, and appearance. So if anyone's ever interested in visiting this site, have a word with me, and I can get this up on a finer map. One of the problems I had today was trying to get the aerial photography linked up, and I thought, right, if there's a more in-depth question, let's sort of answer that again. And there he is on the wall. Wonderful. And it's the other thing as well is, since they've cleared it, some of the walls have, and not undoubtedly, some of the walls have actually eroded further, because lots of the roots were keeping the walls integral, and there has been a decline since some of these photographs were actually taken. And again, you've got behind that building, you've got a lined, walled drover's trackway. It again, you sort of squint your eyes and you think, if you put roofs on them and people running around, it's a really interesting, really, it's not witchy or spooky. It's a real nice feeling to do with this site. Now, Bill will know of this site. It's known as Hound Tor. Now, any questions about the other site we can do when we get to the end. If I want to show you where this is, that's Hound Tor. So we're supposed to be looking at places in Cornwall, but I just thought I'd expand to a few other areas, and this isn't too far away from Cornwall. Because Pete's not there, this would be part of Old Cornwall in the past. That's a good one, Bill. So Hound Tor. When we went to Hound Tor, we just tried to work out what these buildings meant. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 farmsteads. There are other farmsteads, 9, 10, 11. In my notes, it says that there's these little homestead type buildings, but there's a lot more of them than the notes tell you. And I wandered around this site making a film, which is on YouTube. And you go into this site and you see these walls and you get very lost. And the questions kept coming up. What does all this mean? Really, what does all this mean? Could I give a description of what this village looked like? Was it a village abandoned for this reason or that reason? Or was it being abandoned because of the plague? Was it abandoned because of climatic conditions? But let's just read what we have, and with this in the background, and let's show you a little bit of reconstruction. And you'll be right in thinking that those buildings there are the buildings that I helped reconstruct in the 1980s at Cosmeston Medieval Village. In fact, that's what Hound Tor probably looked like, with nice thatched roofs in this type of semi-desolate landscape. Is really nice on a nice day, and that's when we actually went down there. So what some of the buildings at Hound Tor actually looked like. Just a little bit of an interjection. When you do go to Cosmeston Medieval Village, and it shows these buildings at Cosmeston, and it says, this is what a medieval village looked like in Wales 800 years ago. They didn't, because for health and safety, they built all the buildings out of stone so that it would reduce the risk of fire. In fact, buildings across most of Cumbria would have had 4 or 5 courses of stone on the base, and the rest of the building would be a timber frame structure with door panels and a thatched roof. But at Hound Tor, they would have been like this. These really tall walls, and some of the walls at Hound Tor are about 1.5 meters, 2 meters in height. So what really did happen to Hound Tor? Let's just give you a little idea. Let's just keep this image in the background. And I do hope that Ellen will put a thumbs up and say that we are looking at the remains of several buildings, aren't we, Ellen? Thumbs up. Thank you. Good, Ellen. So, Hound Tor. Now, I've got a nice little bit of a about Hound Tor. Hound Tor, deserted medieval village, perched atop a valley in the Dartmoor National Park, lies the mysterious, eerie and deserted medieval village of Hound Tor, known as Honda Tora. Sounds like a foreign country. It was excavated in the 1960s. Historians now believe that the land around Hound Tor had been farmed not just in the period of the medieval village that the buildings tell us that they're from, but the landscape had been farmed for thousands of years. And probably by the time this village was at its height, in the mid-1300s, the landscape at that point was exhausted. And not large-scale clearances from these landscapes were undertaken, large-scale abandonments of these landscapes, because conditions got really bad. In fact, conditions didn't get really bad in the mid-1300s for people at this village. They got really bad across the whole of Britain in the 1300s. We always think, and we always look at these landscapes in isolation, and we think that it's only these areas that are abandoned, but bits of towns and cities are being abandoned at this time as well, because there's famine, there's that thing that we don't talk about, the plague, wiping out 2/3 of the British population. Things got really bad. This village itself was around and recorded in the Domesday Book. It was recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. And it described that there was 6 households, 7 cattle, 28 sheep, 18 goats, and was ruled by a Lord Reginald, who would have probably been a Norman coming in to put his thumb within this landscape and to say he's in charge. And that's another thing as well. When people describe medieval villages as being Norman villages, there was probably a village there before the Normans ever got there. Reginald reigned over this landscape. probably never seen in his lordship, but it was under his charge. And strangely enough, we don't know much more than that. We don't know much more about most of these villages. We know in the archaeology from the 1960s that Hundator was abandoned sometime about 1350, and by the early 1400s, the village was entirely deserted and all farming had ceased. Now, I think you could easily jump in there, 1350, the plague, but there's lots of things going on. Big reasons for abandoning villages in the medieval period. And this is one thing that I've mentioned in the past. Whenever you look at maps and it shows deserted medieval villages, it's easy for an archaeologist like me to say they were abandoned because of the plague, but they've been abandoned in the medieval period. Villages, in other words, have been abandoned throughout generations. They're always being abandoned for one reason or another. One of the big reasons, as I've intimated, is that in the 1300s, a village like this, it had everything, but it was on a knife edge. On the climate level, the weather deteriorated in the 1300s. Between 1315, 1317, you've got something known as the Great Famine. And the small famines throughout the 1300s. And the famines were caused by extraordinary cold winters being followed up by wet and cold summers. So if you're planting crops, they would be flooded out and they wouldn't ripen. And when you want to harvest them in, you can't. You've got ergot problems. And it's believed in the 1300s that the weather pattern was affected by volcanic activity. Wait for it. In far-flung places like New Zealand. So it's amazing that, very odd that we've got New Zealand affecting, our weather patterns. Interesting. During these periods of famine, life expectancy had dropped to a mere 79 years. 79 years old, blimey hell. 29 years old, 29 years old. That was the average of life expectancy. So you can imagine you're putting a lot of energy into your children, and then you fall ill, and your children are weak, and so on. But medieval England had another enemy to contend with, as we know, the Black Death. The first reports of the plague on English soil, Southampton, June 1348. And by its conclusion, a third of the Devon population had been wiped out. Life expectancy during this period had dropped to just 17 years. And actually, in parts of Wales, 90% of the population was lost. So Devon fared quite well in the plague, actually. It's only a third of the population. It fared quite well. In the case of Hound Tor, it would have been a combination of all these things, all these changes, to blame for the village being deserted. But we will never be completely sure. And for those that haven't visited Hound Tor, it is possible to visit the remains of Hound Tor, and indeed, they're quite remarkable. You don't get medieval villages like this. You get lots of Iron Age villages. There's a few Iron Age villages, as we said. There's examples in Cornwall. There's examples in Cumbria. There's examples in Orkney. Couldn't find one in Cumbria, but there's lots of them. But medieval villages that you can see the walls that have been excavated sticking out. You don't really get them. And it's a good 15-20 minutes walk from the car park, but you can actually get there. And you see these long houses and barns, and there's grain dryers. There was something that we weren't sure of that day, and it turned out to be grain dryers, and I'll show you what they are, Bill. So, and the long houses, remember that medieval farmers in the 1200s weren't too worried about getting close and personal with their livestock. So the long houses were to keep the livestock close. So the livestock, it said, would live at one end and the family would live at the other end, or the family would live in a little bit of a loft overlooking the animals at Cosmeston Medieval Village. In the Byra Cosmeston Medieval Village, the wonderful reconstruction that they built first, you see that the animals are down below and there's like a loft area, and that's where they would have slept. And yeah, that's how they lived. And that wasn't very, living with cattle, no matter how clean your animals are, all you need is one animal to have anthrax and you're all going to die. A little scratch with anthrax, it gets in there, the pores spread and multiply, and oh God, horrible stuff. So we'll have a look at some more images of this wonderful village, and it's very near this wonderful outcrop as well. As there's, you know, it's overlooked by two tors. These one being a hound tor, and you've got the other tor a bit further by it, which we didn't actually get to. And in many ways, we've got these medieval villages, and this is the entry in the Domesday Book. Reginald, the Lord of Hundertor, and it describes cattle, and it describes a sheep, and it describes the buildings, and that's all that we've got history-wise. And if we want to compare this with our site of Graig near Abergavenny, we think, well, we've got historical references to these places, and we still lose them, and we still forget about them, and they're still lost in history in a way. So if we move on again, just got to I got something. Hang on a minute, I just got to alter something. Hang on. Excellent. And you know what I'm like with my little maps. You've got the Great Tor and Hound Tor, the medieval village. But like lots of these sites, they're within a landscape of earlier villages. And we mentioned that the Hound Tor site was within a landscape of previous villages and so on. Burial landscape. You look at a map in regards to lots of these different sites that we look at throughout the weeks, you see lots of other things on the landscape. Burial places, field patterns, and at the end we'll talk about field patterns. So these are the buildings at Hound Tor, and some of the walls are 1.5 to 2 meters in height. You have a hall-like building with a porch. You have external storage buildings for animals, and you have access to other buildings along the side. I remember being on the site and I said this is likely to be the premier person in the village, like the village reeve, not the lord, but the person. The reeve was the person who sorted things out in the village on behalf of the lord. He probably lived in this type of building. And again, after 700 years, it's remarkably very well preserved. Again, there's so, like the other village that we looked at, there's so much more to be seen here. The buildings that you can see, the walls that you can see, are the walls of the buildings that have been excavated. And if you look at this image, you can see other humps and bumps around the map of other buildings that could be equally excavated. Again, we've already seen this one. And there is something I wanted to show Bill. Bill, you know, we went onto site and there was these weird little apertures, and there was like a platform above it, and at the backs of buildings, they're actually corn dryers, natural corn dryers, or they may have had small hearths in them to dry out the corn, but they actually had in their buildings corn dryers as well, which were within their buildings. So with this landscape, there might have been other reasons why this landscape was abandoned, like we've mentioned throughout as well. So I thought when I was looking at this, I looked at Orkney and I thought there are lots of buildings abandoned on Orkney, little homesteads and farmsteads and little crofts here and there. But I couldn't find a village on Orkney that illustrated abandonment in the way abandonment is shown on the island of St. Kilda. And the one I actually came across was an abandoned settlement on St. Kilda. The stony ruins are made up of cottages that were built during the 1800s. A long sort of row of cottages left abandoned and isolated. It is said that several residents of the village of St. Kilda were unable to survive the diseases that were widespread at the time and either passed away or moved to another town. And when you look at this, it's an interesting thing. We don't really know what the backstory is with lots of these villages. I've looked at a cottage in the heart of mid Wales, and it looks like it was abandoned 20 years ago. It's still got the roof on it, and there's this little piano in the room, and there's all these things, and people go in there and make films. It's in the middle of nowhere, and there's no reason. We don't know, except for a card on the mantelpiece saying happy 88th birthday. But no family goes back and claims these buildings. It's really strange. And look at that. Isn't that so eerie? If we talk about abandoned villages, so eerie. This is again on St. Kilda, and this is before they started at St. Kilda. There's a military base, so they started to convert some of the buildings into storage buildings, and you've got this little bit of a terrace along there, and you're thinking again contemporary with the buildings that we've seen at the beginning near Abergavenny. These buildings have been abandoned, and you think, well, they look perfect, and in many ways people could give these buildings a go now because you've got access to the internet and you've got access to solar energy and there's lots of water. All you really need is food and you're ready to go. But 150 years ago, these people didn't have all this technology, and the sense of isolation was really isolated, particularly if you've got children who have moved away or you've fallen ill and all these other explanations that we have. Look at that there. So we've got that very eerie image at St. Kilda, and the village, it's called the village. So if you ever want to look at this, you type in the village and you come to this. And I'm just going to double check one thing as well, just looking at this. There is another name for this. I think it's something like Hertha. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, back to my notes. And you look at this and you think some of these buildings are so pristine, the roofs have gone, and again they've just been left. And again, if anyone has seen the whole reason why we're doing this, i.e. comparison, so I've done that. But I'm also trying to put across that when you see explanations by archaeologists for abandonment of sites, so say for example they found a Roman villa, and the Roman villa, they found some golden coins and they found a thick black layer, and they've dated the site as being abandoned around 415 on the 24th of August, whatever. Yeah. And they always say, well, obviously they buried their coins because they were threatened, and the proof that they were threatened was their building was burnt to the ground, and obviously they never came back to live there because they were killed. And you're thinking, well, would archaeologists say the same about these buildings? Would they say that if they excavated one of these buildings and they found a little crock of coins in there, and it turned out that they had been excavating through timber that had been burnt, would they say that these people were murdered? The answer is they might. But we do know in modern memory something about what happened to these, and they weren't wiped out due to a great hoard. But what I'm trying to say is always examine the evidence a little tighter and try to understand it a little bit more before jumping into there fully. Put your own feet into the shoes of these people. Put yourself into an environment that was very different in the past, and then try and understand. And as they've that sort of projected image now, it's very much changed. And they put some roofs on there for a little bit more longevity, and so on and so on. Again, look at that, quite eerie as buildings go. As I said, I couldn't find anything like this on Orkney. It was more individual buildings. And I did actually find some other things like this in Cumbria, but it was on the lines of lunatic asylums and various other things like that. So this is the nearest I could get in Orkney. And one of the things is that islands seem to have suffered the same fate as places like Cornwall and places like Cymru, because it's the same thing that people want to move from these upland areas and they want to go to the cities to work, like they're doing in Japan, and they're leaving behind their families and all these different things, movement. But lots of people are looking at these and thinking, I want to move back to these places because times have changed. These people were reliant upon the landscape. Lots of people moving back to these places are not reliant upon the landscape. As long as you've got a vehicle, you're fine. If you want to drive 20 miles down the road to the nearest Tesco's, it's fine. I'll jump on the ferry. It's okay, whatever. So the interaction with the landscape is changed, and that's another thing as well, is people may abandon the landscape because their relationship with the landscape has changed. They don't want to be there anymore, and when in past times people did want to be there. I thought maybe Pete might be with us tonight, and I just thought he wasn't able to join us tonight. And this itself, the illustration behind us, is very much what lots of these types of villages throughout time eventually look like, just a field which is overgrown. I wanted to look at Stormy Down, actually, because Stormy Down, just near Bridgend, there's the remains of several medieval villages there, and I just thought it'd probably be a bit too much to put that in today. I'd probably kept that for another occasion. But that's one of those sites that is slowly being lost in time. And the one behind us is Bodmin Moor. So you're coming into Cornwall again. This is a place called Trewartha, a settlement. Lots of these villages are to be found under the ground with long houses. This one, 4 or 5 rectangular long houses, corn drying barns, walls, outlying settlements containing ridge and furrow evidence, because they ploughed the landscape. Lots of evidence. If you don't find the buildings, you usually got ridge and furrow, those big 1 meter tall ridges that they planted on the top of the ridge, and in the ditch they would drain away. And again, this is going to be the fate of lots of those villages throughout time. Eventually, Mother Nature takes those buildings back if they're not cared for, if they're not looked at. And Houndtor, the village at Houndtor, was one of these such villages behind us, except it's been excavated and you can still see the walls 1 meter, 1.5 meters tall today. Where are we now? I just that's our Trewether, that there X marks the spot, if you wanted to know where that one was. And this is what lots of these may have looked like. And there's another point to be made as well. Lots of these villages that remained in use beyond the medieval period into the Tudor Stuart period. When archaeologists have excavated, long bands like this still existed in some highland areas of Scotland. Through the archaeology, this is what we see. And in many ways, what buildings once looked like in the medieval period still look like what they looked like in the medieval period hundreds of years on. I remember Michelle and I, when we went to Orkney, we visited some nice longhouses in Orkney, which were very like this, with nice thatch and nice woodwork inside, low-lying ceilings. It was wonderful. And if it's not broken, you don't need to repair it. So the designs of these buildings, as we see throughout time, remain the same. Crofters' cottages, little sort of enclosed areas. And again, if I had more time, I could have, Michelle and I have been on some adventures and we've seen isolated little miniature villages in the middle of nowhere. And you look at them and you think, well, this would be a really nice place to live, wouldn't it? And over time, again, lots of reasons why people desert these landscapes. And I wanted to bring you back somewhere more down to earth. Lots of us would know where this is. This is the landscape of Pen y Fan, which is very near Storey Arms. And I wanted to sort of go here on a little bit of a journey for all of us, a little bit of homework, actually. But I wouldn't advise it. I wouldn't advise it anytime soon because, you know, because of the lockdown and everything, everyone goes to this landscape and parks their car. This is an image from the summertime, actually. But as you go from Merthyr Tydfil, and you pass the Great Reservoir on the left, and you go through, and you pass Storey Arms on the right, and there's a forest behind. And then you go around, then you go a very sharp bend. So you go around here and you sort of go off, and there's a sharp bend, there's a pull-in. The interesting thing is if you park your car on this bend, then you can park the old road, and you're able to sort of safely get across the road. You look down into this valley, and what you will see, to the marvel of your eye, if it's in the winter months as well, you'll see lots of remains of buildings and lots of remains of ridge and furrow systems, old farming systems. But this landscape is now more or less completely abandoned. You'll find 1 or 2 buildings across this landscape. And it's one of those things as well. There are other reasons why people might abandon these landscapes. They might be mining for ores or a Blaenau Ffestiniog. They might be slate mining. And just it's simply the industry has gone. It's like the miners of Cornwall. The industry has gone. As over time, agriculture has gone. And I wanted to just give us another experience of comparison tonight. And I wanted to do it before I did next week's, which we're going to be looking at ancient woodlands. And I've got a really nice example that we're going to be looking at next week in regards to the island of Hoy. Bill didn't exactly quite get there with me. It's a place known as Berriedale Wood. You had 2 opportunities, Bill, and you blew both of them. But we'll look at those. We'll look at that next week. And I want to look at 1 or 2 ancient woodlands in Cumbria. There are examples in Cumbria. And I'm not exactly sure about Cornwall. So that's going to be a challenge. So what I'm going to do, that's a really nice place to finish. A nice bit of homework when you're up there. Safely park your car. Usually deep December time where there's very little cars using this road. Get across, past the barrier, look, and you can see actually lots of the landscape. And actually there's a burger van a bit further on as well on another pull-in, which actually overlooks her again. You miss the sort of angle, but you can probably gauge a little bit more about what I'm talking about from there as well. So that's a good place to stop actually now. So I'm going to find out if there are any questions. Pat is still awake. Either that's a sign that she didn't enjoy this, or she's still seeing election results coming in from the United States. So Goff, anything you would like to say, darling?
No questions. Very interesting, very thought-provoking. Thank you.
It is. That is a nice one, that one. Ellen, trees next week. So we're going to get into those trees, me and you, Ellen. Anything you'd like to say?
It was lovely today. It was all like a very close human connection, wasn't it?
Yes. Nice tender connection, yes. And in a way, when we think about trees as well for next week, the reason why we've got lots of these woodlands that survive is because humans have left them alone. So that's humans thinking outside the box and thinking, we'll keep this. So there's a nice tender connection there as well. That sort of great understanding of the great outdoors. Bill.
Yes, in my ramblings over the hills of South Wales over the years, I haven't come across an abandoned village, but you do come across quite a number of abandoned farmhouses without buildings. Yes. And you go in some of these, if it's safe to do so, which it isn't always, because the roof is in such a bad state, and you think to yourself, if I get to remove all the rubble from the floors here, I could find something interesting. It gives you that sort of expectation of finding something. Yeah. And in one instance, we came across an abandoned farmstead in the hills above Neath, and coming towards us with 2 metal detectorists who'd been having a go. They hadn't found anything that day, but a month previously they had. They showed us what they'd found, and there was a few little metallic objects, like decorative pieces, which are dated. But not only that, they showed us 2 coins they found, and you could see the image there was Elizabeth I. So there is treasure there in these places, and you actually want to go and explore, don't you? Because you think there must be something here of interest. You really do, don't you? You get that urge to do something and go and find it. Yep.
And it's just that moving. I'll tell you a little bit of a backstory, right? It's like moving over that stone, isn't it? Don't forget about metal detecting and digging. Just moving that little stone. Is there something to that? You can move that stone and move it. And there was in 1956 there was a young lad called Howard Thomas. He was 13 years old. He was rooting around Penmark Castle, and he was moving stones, and he lifted up this one stone, and there was this metal container, and it turned out to have about £450 in notes back then.
Yeah.
Sort of in a
amazing.
That is treasure.
Yippee, eureka.
Yeah, exactly. That is notes, you know.
They're not treasures though. These abandoned farmhouses and villages, they are treasures, and they really are.
They are treasures, and going back away from the artifacts and stuff, and that sort of tender link. It's like touching the walls and seeing the fireplaces, knowing that the last person who used this fireplace was the person who lived there.
Yeah.
And the last person who looked out that window with glass in it actually lived there. And maybe the last person people who were on that slab, who were
That's
playing
right.
with children.
And one final point, the
Yeah.
last image you showed of the Story Arms and that abandoned village, the original coach road from Merthyr to Brecon is in the little valley below that settlement. And if you walk down there, the old road down to Brecon, again, there are buildings alongside there which have been long abandoned, which could well be from they were from a much earlier period, you know. So there's so much to see there, especially along abandoned roads, where there's been road improvements over the years, bypasses. The old roads are just left. And that's where a lot of information is, lots of abandoned buildings are too, and homesteads, etc. So
And-
much we found out there.
And there's a village in Velga Morgan called Tredugan, and the airport's been going on about wanting to build on it since the dinosaurs. And you get old farms, and there's some buildings, and it's all caving in and so on, right?
Yeah.
They said to move out and compulsory purchase, and they've done nothing with it for like decades and decades.
Yeah.
It's a typical thing. It's like the MOD as well. It's that MOD. We're gonna need the village. We're gonna need your village for troops to be billeted, and they never give the villages back. All that type of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's those reasons as well. You know, it's that sense that it's used for a little while, and it's not given back.
Yeah. Well, the real people live here. Sometimes you can sense it. You know, so much went on in this
exactly.
places. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Carl.
And finally, Pat, you get the last word, Patricia.
Well, thanks a lot. I had trouble getting in on my laptops. This is my phone I'm on, so I could get in and be with the dogs. And my money is coming through. Tomorrow I'll send my membership in.
Oh, how did you? Oh, you must have had a knock on the doors off the boys today then. That guy with the yellow face was in fact Donald Trump. He's now the guy who's collected money for Archaeology Cymru. That's his new job.
New job.
That's his new job. Yeah.
I
miss the entertainment value really well.
The thing is, he hasn't given me any of the money that he's collected yet.
You won't see it.
I won't see it. Great. Anyway, folks, that's been a really good one. I do believe I'm seeing all of you tomorrow. Moral of the story is, don't change anything that you're signing in on tomorrow. But this has been a great one. I've really enjoyed this. And next week we've got trees. Love it.
Great.
Take care, guys. Take care. Ellen,
Bill,
Pat, and Garth.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, folks. Hi, hopefully you've liked the recording this evening. If anyone's interested in joining my online classes, I do teach 3 different types of classes every week. One looking at the archaeology of various different sites across the world. This comparison of archaeology on a Wednesday evening, and I've got looking at landscape archaeology on a Thursday evening every single week, and my comparison of archaeology across the world I teach on a Tuesday evening, and the same class on a Monday, on a Thursday morning and a Thursday afternoon. You'll be very, very welcome. There's our email address, www.archaeologycymruonline.weebly.com. And also I've got a live show in Chepstow next year, April 10th. And there it is. So if anyone would like to subscribe as well, I'll be very grateful, and always answer questions on this very lecture today. Very interesting looking at various settlements. So thank you very, very much. This is KARL-JAMES LANGFORD And thanks for your support. Over and out for today. More next week, looking at comparisons with various woodlands across Great Britain. Thank you.